Yes. So, what did Germany start in 1917 that would anger Americans? Unrestricted submarine warfare. What was the ship they sank in 1915? Didn't get into the war. Yeah, the Lusitania, but that would kind of be sitting in the background. And so all of a sudden, when those who said, hey, we have to go to the war, remember how barbarous they were? The Lusitania. Oh, where was the first genocide? Yeah, Armenia, but what empire did it? The Ottomans. And that enemy within. There's all that horrific logic of total war. Oh, and man, who was the first one to bomb civilians from the air? Germans. And it's not that Germans are any more evil than anyone else. What a weird way to say it. But they were the ones who were surrounded and the most desperate. So they are also the first ones to do gas. And because the Allies jumped right in on it. And we got the declaration of war. Did we get to, what was the note to try to convince Mexico to enter the war? And the thing about that was, don't forget basic diplomacy. We had economic interests. There was a lot of economic issues. Did we get to this? So that's what Wilson claimed is the reason. And that's the whole thing about the Russian Revolution. The first one created a republic. And when the republic was created in Russia, the thought was, hey, they're now going to be a democracy, so we're not fighting for the autocratic czar. The first Russian Revolution created a republic. That's what the thought was. So we could say it's for democracy. So there's an element of that truly there. But then propaganda. The whole issue about poor little Belgium, that was ingrained in American thinking, British thinking. It was such a powerful image. And there was a lot of truth to it, and then, of course, greatly exaggerated. And to this day, Germany kind of downplays it. Partially because they have their own issues coming up in the next World War, which they downplay all the time. And every country downplays their atrocities. And then a biggie, a huge issue that was under the radar that would become a massive issue in the 1930s in the run-up to the next war. American banks were buying British debt, bonds, a lot of it. 1916, after the Somme and Verdun went so badly, they basically went hat in hand to the British Treasury and begged Wall Street investment banks to buy British bonds. And that means interest rates that Britain had to give went out of the world, and that means U.S. banks now own all of these bonds. And they won't get repaid. Don't worry about trade yet. They won't get repaid until what happens? Britain has to win. And so this is a really important issue. The banks begin at the end of 1916, started pushing for a bigger American role. We need Britain to win. And this combines with massive increases in trade. Companies are making a lot of money, and more people are thinking this basic idea, think how much money we'll make if Britain or the United States is an ally. Now, this is pretty short-term thinking because think about the horrific costs. But then again, those people, the banks or the big monopolies, they're not thinking that because they're not the ones who are going to fight and die in a trench. Remember Hamilton saying way back when, remember Alexander Hamilton, and he wanted to buy back all the bonds because he basically said merchants aren't loyal to the country, they're only loyal to money. That thinking would come back big time. Of course, Hamilton said that was a good thing. In the 1930s, with the Great Depression, many people believing with, I think, very good justification that banks and finance made it so awful, the Great Depression, we're not going to allow banks and desire for money get us into another European war. That's part of the reason the United States is going to be isolationist. Now, we have the wondrous ability to look back in time and realize, oh, Nazi Germany was really, really bad. But in 1930, that's why they were so isolationist. And so, these are the big reasons for war. And, but we can't get back to this U-boat thing is underlying everything. The U-boats. And everything related back to U-boats. You know, look how barbarous those governments are. So we got to support democracies and make democracy because the German autocratic state is so evil. Now, of course, the Allies are blockading, doing a starvation blockade too. Belgium, we must save them because of U-boats. We're going to lose the money because of U-boats. U-boats are behind everything. And so with that, don't write this down. This just gives an idea of the exports. And it's almost a straight 45-degree angle up of the amount of exports to Allied powers during the war. The numbers, don't worry about it. I just wanted you to see the graph. So with that, April 2nd, 1917, Congress declared war. President Wilson signed it. And if you look at that cartoon, see in his hand, American ship sunk without warning. What if the Germans wouldn't have sunk without warning? If the U-boats just would have stopped ships and scuttled them and allowed the crews to get on lifeboats safely, would America enter the war? And who knows how history would be different. And I've read a few books. It's a very good book called Castles of Steel about the naval war in World War I. Really well done book by his great historian, Robert Massey. And he says, yeah, they should have done that. Germany might have won. Who knows? Because that wouldn't have been probably Nazi Germany, maybe not the Bolshevik Revolution. Who knows? Wow. What's the only thing we do know? No, we'd be speaking Bulgarian. That would happen. That's the only sure thing. So, as we can see, class is ready. Organized, you're happy, and that can only mean one thing. Yay! And now you got 2 minutes. Evaluate a statement. Now this one's a lot easier to find a why. Now, you can do the basic format of the thesis, or if you want to disagree with that statement, say, I disagree with this because of, and then give 2 reasons why. So despite one reason, I believe in these things. But the why is how you evaluate that statement. Yes, the United States entered the war for economic reasons and not democracy, or no, it was to make the world safe and modern. I'm giving you lots of reasons why the U.S. entered, right? So your why is going to be your stand on this statement. Good A, B, and C, which are basically the reasons for the war. Go back and look at it. Make sure you have a why, an A, B, and C. Think about, okay, can I make these into paragraphs, which are essentially glorified short IDs. The DBQ is glorified short IDs with documents instead of facts, but same thing. The facts related to documents. Did I tell you my Verdun story? We're going to the thesis, I'll tell you my Verdun story. You should be finishing. I know I'm pushing you. Somebody's like, ah! This wouldn't be a bad question. Stand on the statement. 3 reasons for the war related back to the statement. It's good. You just have to address that. And that's fine. I mean, it would have been okay, but just address what's good. And even without having that, at least I know where you're going. Just make sure you address the question. That's not big. Are we done? We done? Okay, as soon as you're done exchange, read it to each other. Let's see if we got something. Make sure you address the question. Make sure you have a good why, A, B, and C. And I know I'm just thinking, okay, we got limited time. And hey, the great thing is, you're doing it the first time. When you're actually writing the essay, you might want to, you can change it a little bit. How do we do? Everyone like their thesis statements? No. Just make it the most basic way. If you get a statement, your why is just simply if you agree or disagree. So, he did not try to make the world safe for democracy, but it was for more economic reasons. Why? Because of A, B, and C. Or the war was for democracy despite the economic reasons for the war. Because of this, and this. Or despite economic reasons for the war for the banks, it was to make the world safe for democracy, as seen in the Russian support of the Russian Republic and support for poor little Belgium. And so, let me give you mine. Are you ready? Are you excited? One thing I would do that when I look back, I would have put the world safe for democracy in quotes. You know, but that's simple, isn't it? I bet people have something like that. And all the way I do is you got to make sure when each of these parts, you address it back to something about the economic issues and not for just for democracy. Look good? You want to see one more? This one I didn't use U-boats because I just decided not to. So here I talk about, yes, they mentioned democracy, but that wasn't the real reason. That would be my A. But my real reason is, no, it's for economic reasons, as in I just put on banks and trade. I could have put unrestricted summer warfare, and that would be the trade, but for some reason I wrote that. And literally what I do is I do this every year when I do it. And I did it last night before I went home. I just quick retyped it. I made myself erase the old one and redo it, just to think it out again. And then I wrote the essay. No, I did not do that. I've done that a few times. Every once in a while, I'll do that just to remind myself what to do. Because I am making you write one. And I know, got to do it. That would be a good question. And the only reason I like evaluation ones, and I know you might have found this one hard or not, but you can just take a stand, and that's your why. When it's in like, analyze the factors, then it starts getting broad and it's more difficult. But we'll do more of each. The next one we're going to do is about the ratification battle of the Treaty of Versailles, the next thesis. As luck would have it, that thesis will involve a document-based question. If you're not going to be here tomorrow, please let me know. I'll give you the documents. All right? So let's get to the U-boats. The U-boat offensive, it almost worked. All those red dots are ships that were sunk in the year of the unrestricted submarine warfare, but most of those were sunk in those first few months. individual ships going into Britain were sunk one by one, and they had to go to emergency rations, food shortages. It looked bad. And by May, it might have worked. The British government almost was near collapse. But then Britain finally made the big shift to convoys. Instead of individual ships running, they thought would kind of be easier to slip by individual ships. They started getting convoys escorted by Royal Navy and then soon American vessels of 30, 40, 50 transport ships, freighters, all in one big group. The British thought if a submarine found a big group of ships like this, they could knock out 3 or 4, and so it'd be easier to slip by one ship. But the ocean is so vast that it is almost as easy, in fact, mathematically as easy, to slip by a 30-ship convoy as it is to slip by one ship. Because the ocean is so big. It's so easy to miss 30 ships, let alone one ship. And the submarines were just planted and just kind of floating and hoping a ship would come by. So they could slip by a 30-ship convoy. And it worked. Overnight, the U-boat losses dropped dramatically. They were able to get almost 2 million American soldiers across with no ships sunk, no American troop ships sunk. Lots of other ships were sunk. And it worked. When World War II began, in fact, even before, when the run-up, the week or so before, September 1st, 1939, when Germany attacked Poland, the British were already organizing convoys. This time they didn't wait. And all through the Cold War of the Soviet Union, the thought was that there was going to be a war in Europe. The United States had plans for convoys to organize almost immediately to slip past Soviet submarines. It's all planned like this. Japan was reluctant to do it, and boy, would they pay a price in World War II. So with that, while this is going on, we got to get back to Russia a little bit. Russia was approximately on this red line right here. And in 1916, when they finally started getting more ammunition to try to coincide with the Somme, they did a massive offensive. Those are Russian troops advancing right there, called the Brusilou offensive. And it was named after the general. It actually broke through the Austrian lines and advanced about 50 miles. Now, 50 miles might seem like a lot if you're walking 50 miles, but remember, that's just basically this right here. Just a tiny little bit. It didn't alter the war. It did convince Romania to enter the war, and Germany promptly defeated them. But the Russians had 1 million casualties in a month. It was awful. And then that winter was bad. Food shortages, starvation in the streets, especially big cities. Factory workers were working 12, 15 hours a day to try to get munitions out, and then starving at home. And the crown appeared to be corrupt. Rasputin's influence was seen by many of nobility as going to destroy the Tsar, and therefore their life as a noble one. And there is Rasputin carousing in Petrograd, what they call St. Petersburg. And all these wealthy, aristocratic women just surrounded him like a harem. And I don't get why he was mystical, but then again, you look into his eyes and they seem to be boring into your soul, don't they? Look at those eyes. And the thought was this was corrupting the monarchy. And many people began to believe he was controlling the Tsar and the Tsarina. That creepy picture right there. And so at the end of 1916, the plan was to assassinate him. Felix Yusupov, you don't even know him, you just always forget his name. He was a prince. He was called Prince Aspinall, but he was just basically a boyar, a nobleman in Russia. And he decided, we got to get rid of him, or the Tsar is going to be overthrown and will be overthrown. And so they knew Rasputin actually was in love with the wife of one of their friends, so they convinced Rasputin, she's at her house waiting for you. And he went there and they said, just wait, she'll be here in a few minutes. And him and the other conspirators proceeded to give him sweetened wine and these cakes he really liked that were laced with enough cyanide they thought to kill 20 people. Now, he was suspicious but he still drank the wine and passed out, and then got up and kind of threw up. Like, how is he not dead? And so then they tried to pull out the gun, and he lunged at them with all this cyanide in it. So they proceeded to beat him with a fireplace poker and then shoot him twice. And while with 2 bullets in, he still managed to get outside of the house. That is him running away till they finally put the fatal bullet in. Now, it probably was the fatal bullet, but the story was they took Rasputin to the Neva River. It's December, so they dropped him in a hole in the ice, and they found his body the next day under the ice. And the story was that his fingernails were ripped off and his lungs were full of water. What did that mean? He drowned and was trying to scratch his way through the ice. And so they just left him there. And still, someday. No, they didn't. But they cut off various body parts, which are in jars now at the Medical Institute in St. Petersburg, and you can visit them. Moving on, that's his body after they found him. That gives you the idea of the brutal beating they put on him to try to kill him. This is going to become the thing of great legend. Did it save the monarchy? No. Rasputin was corrupt. The whole thing was corrupt. But the big thing was people were starving and they were losing hundreds of thousands of men every month in this war. And that's going to lead to the February Revolution. You notice that's only 2 months before the Americans entered the war. And it happened right during the beginning of the German U-boat offensive. And how did Germany feel about this revolution? Yes. Were they helping? They're trying to help. Now, but what really triggered it was food riots. Here are food riots in Petrograd. And once that happened, soldiers were ordered to fire on them. Instead, they joined them. Remember, this happened a few times in America. And so when they joined, boom, that was it. The generals told the Tsar, you have to abdicate. And he went to the Summer Palace and kind of waited it out. They created a republic, and it's going to be called the Kerensky government, or the Kerensky Constitution, the Kerensky Republic. Alexander Kerensky was a moderate socialist. He was the defense minister right here. And even though he would only be the prime minister for a very short time, he was the ideological leader of this republic. And he was presented with a problem. The war. Do we stay in the war? The people want out. Do we stay in? Because if we leave, whatever treaty we sign with Germany, after what happened in the last offensive and the way we left, we'll lose everything. We will lose. And our allies might lose the war. We need a victory. So Kerensky persuaded the government to stay in the war. They stayed in the war. And this would be a disastrous mistake. They tried another offensive here in 1917, and it failed miserably, and the army mutinied. Remember the video had the army mutiny? That was the mutiny. Now, it was going to coincide with a British offensive here that got bogged down in the mud. A French offensive here that led to a French mutiny. An Italian offensive here that the Germans and the Austrians counterattacked and almost knocked Italy out of the war. A failed offensive in Greece. A disappointing offensive way down here and here and here. The point is, it was all over and it failed. And now the Russian army literally just was walking home. In fact, the Germans are like, okay, bye. They don't know what to do. Do we follow? Do we just let them collapse and then move in and get the spoils? Which, yeah. And so, here's Kerensky trying to keep the Russian bear in the war. You see Kerensky? Get back to the front. And who's pulling them back? A tiny little group of very determined communists called the Bolsheviks. And that leads us to the October Revolution. You'll see this also called the Bolshevik or the Russian Revolution. But there's 2 Russian revolutions at this time. Now, the October Revolution happened in November, of course. I think I told you why. They were still on the old Julian calendar, which didn't have leap years. So every year they went a little bit further behind because they forgot the leap year. And so they were about 11 days behind. So they were in November when they actually did the revolution on their calendar. They wouldn't change to the Gregorian calendar, which we are on now, until 1922. So the Gregorian calendar would be done in the 16th century. That's the end of my calendar discussion. Moving on. The Bolsheviks were radical communists. And even though the term Bolshevik means the majority, it was actually a tiny group. There are other socialist groups that were bigger, like the Mensheviks, but they were very determined, and they had been trying to undermine the Soviet or the Russian state for years. And so when war began, the Bolsheviks were overjoyed. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, right here, was in exile in Switzerland. And he thought this war, if it goes badly for Russia, would be our opportunity for revolution. And so he was overjoyed. I know this is ruthless and horrible, but overjoyed at the Russian losses, overjoyed at the Brusilou offensive, even though it gained some ground, was so bloody. Yeah, it was soft. Heartened by the February Revolution, but realizing it needs to be more. And he vowed to end the war. I'll bring peace and feed the people. There's Lenin right there. Lenin. The problem is Lenin's in Switzerland. Do you look at let's look at the map. Here's Petrograd, the capital of Russia. Here's Switzerland. What's in between Switzerland and Petrograd? A big country called Germany who's at war with Russia. How does he get from here to here? Who might want Lenin to get from here to here? Germany would give him money and aid. Oh, they hated. The German government hated the socialists, but they wanted Lenin. So Germany aided this, and both the Germans and the Bolsheviks would hide this after the war. They took him on a luxury train ride through Germany, gave him money, got him to Finland, which had just declared independence from Russia, and got him into Petrograd. And he began to trigger a revolution. They tried one revolution, failed, he fled back. But then in October, with the war falling apart, it was not bloodless, but not like a huge fight. Just a couple thousand Bolsheviks in Petrograd and Moscow stormed the government and immediately pledged alliances with workers and soldiers groups. Those groups were called Soviets. It just basically means a group of workers or group of Soviets. Soviets. And they vowed peace and won. It happened really fast. The man who organized the revolution was a reluctant ally of Lenin. He's right here next to Lenin. His name is Leon Trotsky. Oh, I'm sorry, almost forgot. Their slogan, it's pretty seductive if you're starving, bread, peace, and land. The peasants were still basically serfs or like sharecroppers. That's basically what sharecroppers were. They wanted out of the war and they were hungry. Hungry people revolt. So remember, when we start our totalitarian state, even before we go to war with somebody, what do we need? Food. Everyone needs like really kind of fatty, greasy food. So they just sit there and watch a screen, right? Who's with me? We're taking over everything. You guys got to do it. They wouldn't pick me. I'm bold. I'll just be behind the scenes, like the puppet master. Okay, moving on. Leon Trotsky, right here, would be the leader of the overthrow, and then would lead the army in the Civil War. But an ally of Lenin who is basically unknown, he just happens to be right here in this picture of Bolsheviks in 1919, with Joseph Stalin. And he is working his way, because the man was incredibly smart and a hard-working psychopath. And he is working his way into the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. Guess what? We will come back to Stalin. Guess who really admires Stalin? The leader of Russia now. He doesn't like, well, he doesn't like this whole communist thing. The leader of Russia is a right-wing autocrat. But he likes Stalin as a leader. So, oh, I almost forgot. I got to show you this picture. Here is Lenin and Trotsky. Stalin would see Trotsky as a major rival and eliminate him and eventually have him murdered, get him out of the country. And so they went back through and they erased history. So you see this picture right here of Lenin and Trotsky? Look at what they would do to this picture after Stalin took power. You see it? They literally painted him out. There's so many pictures. Some of them, they literally just scratched them out because you don't want to be caught with a picture of Trotsky or something. Ah, the wonders of Soviet Russia. So, the October Revolution took place. Get it? It's a communist party. Okay, moving on. And there's Castro and Marx. Okay. 1918, I didn't put the dates, but 1918. Russia basically admitted defeat. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be passed, and this was a horrific, humiliating defeat for the Russians. Humiliating. They had to give up a significant amount of their land, including some of their most industrialized regions. And so the Baltic states here, what is now Poland, what is now Belarus, what is now Ukraine, what is now Moldova, and they conquered Romania too, but they got all this land under German control, and they created puppet governments. A puppet Ukraine government, a puppet White Russian government, a puppet Lithuania, a puppet government in Poland. Absolutely humiliating defeat. And this will have great impact after the war. That's the actual negotiations. So the Western Allies are going to Germany. Why should we be sympathetic to you? Look what you did to the Russians. And in 1939, 1940, Adolf Hitler was always planning an attack on the Soviet Union, on Russia, even though his army was not yet ready to invade Russia at all. He said, of course we can beat Russia. Look what we did in 1918. And that would be the end of Nazi Germany. They would be destroyed by the Soviet Union. But that's another story for down the road. And so, everyone got this, a humiliating defeat. And now, Russia's out of the war. Germany can pull troops to the Western Front before Americans can get there. They might win the war still. And in Russia, this is going to trigger an unbelievable Russian civil war. Millions would die or be tortured, starved to death in this war. There'd be famine, stealing food. There's stories of both sides capturing prisoners and torturing to death by doing things like wrapping them in barbed wire and rolling them down hills. I can't even wrap my mind around how horrible this war was. It would devolve into those who accepted and wanted the Bolshevik rule, soon just basically the Reds. Now, that was always the color of socialism, but it became the color of communism, which is a form of socialism. Red was the color of patriots' blood. This goes back to what's called the French Commune in 1870, 71. Some of you might know about that if you had some European history. The whites were this hodgepodge of different groups who didn't want the Bolsheviks. And so they're always disunified. They had people who wanted the monarchy back. They wanted people who wanted a republic. They wanted people who were like moderate socialists. I mean, this weird group of people. Or they wanted an independent Ukraine, independent White Russia, independent Kazakhstan, things like that. And so the Allies joined in. The Allies wanted the Bolsheviks out, hoping to get Russia back in the war. And so every major Allied country invaded Russia to help the whites and sent weapons. But they also had another fear. What if that socialist revolution spread to France, which had a strong communist party, Italy, which had a strong socialist party, England, the United States? What if it spread, or this anti-war feeling of the socialists spread? So the US, Britain, France, Italy invaded, Japan invaded Vladivostok along with some Americans, and a significant number of Americans, including a regiment from Montana, right there, Montanans, they thought they were going to France. They ended up north of the Arctic Circle up here at Murmansk for a year. technically to fight the Reds, basically just freezing. So all these countries invaded. It failed. It failed in the Civil War. This is the red area. Eventually they were able to defeat the whites, who were always uncoordinated, and the Allies pulled out in 1919. And so a lot of people from Montana ended up at Murmansk. There were a couple battles. They froze in misery and then were sent back. Almost all Americans forgot that the United States invaded Russia. My guess is most of you had no idea. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Once again, that's why we're here. Guess who knows? Everybody in Russia knows this. Every school child is taught this from day one. They're taught it with the old Soviet Union, and they're taught it today. The United States invaded once. The United States hates Russia, and they're coming for you. We can't trust them. They did it once, and they'll do it again. They all know, just like everybody in China knows about the Boxer Rebellion. They all know. And that's actually a real problem when people from the United States try to think about, let's say, foreign policy with countries like Russia. We don't understand their motivation. We can't empathize. Now, you know, isn't that great? We're like a little club. We know stuff. They're real. I mean, they all know this. And so with that, out of this, the Reds would win, and eventually, after a couple different failed names, would come up with the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics. The Soviets are those workers' groups. The USSR, or we see it in Cyrillic, it's CCCP, it's the old Soviet stuff. That is the flag. Someone gave me that. And so I put that up partially because the idea of having that up in a class when I was your age, not even imaginable. And who knows the way people are reacting now, because they don't know that the Soviet Union is gone. It's been gone for 30 years. They think Putin is part of the Soviet Union. But that's the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union would eventually reestablish most of the old Russian Empire. And so there, even though I will say Russians sometimes, there are people in the Soviet Union who are not Russians. So the Soviets are more appropriate. I try to do it, but sometimes it slips out. And they taught socialism. They all said, we're going to create this system of a classless society. The workers will control the means of production. Eventually, we'll no longer need money as we know it. Religion as we used to know it will not be necessary because there'll be no reason to control each other. But before we get there, we got to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, which are the dictatorship of the workers, until the people are ready. The old capitalists have been re-educated. I'll let you ponder what that means. And the workers are ready to have perfect democracy and equal rights. In fact, there were a significant number of women who fought with the Bolsheviks and were in the leadership at first. You can imagine what's going to happen. Because once you get the dictatorship of the proletariat and these men took power, when did they decide that the people were ready for perfect democracy? Never. And what kind of state did they create? A monstrous totalitarian state. They still talk all the time about classless society, but that's not what they do. You give people power, and what do people do? Except in here, we would never do that, right? I have ultimate power. I will never abuse it. Where's my cake? No, moving on. So here we have Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. But soon this will become a massive power. Still talking communist revolution, even though that's not what they really did. And to show you how powerful it was, that is a picture of what? Does anyone know? It's a Soviet flag, but where is it? Huh? That's a Red Army soldier with booted watches on his arm, but that's another story. Huh? That's Berlin. And he just climbed to the top of the Reichstag. It was May 1st, 1945. They destroyed Nazi Germany. Oh no. They beat the Germans and no one thought the Germans could be beaten in 1941. What could they do to us? So thus, this is kind of the beginnings of the Red Scares. Yeah, anybody know who they defeated in the Reichstag, the German parliament? SS-men from Norway. Okay, moving on. A bunch of Norwegians joined the SS, and they fought to the death because they can't go home now. They're traitors to Norway because they joined the Germans. Yeah, so it was Norwegians who fought to the last stand in the German capital. That's surreal. Yeah. So, back to the U.S. We're mobilizing. Let's get the entire economy ready for war. And the U.S. had an army now of a little over 100,000. We had a powerful Navy, but it would just go to blockade duty. We're not ready for war at all. A very industrialized country, but making very few munitions. And so, first thing, you got to pay for the thing. And they reorganized the entire way they do budgets in the government, the entire way they do bonds. The Federal Reserve would be reformed a little bit, and it's brand new. The Federal Reserve we know now would not come about until 1935, but that's another story. And what they did is, start talking and don't swallow. Progressive taxation. And that means taxing upper incomes higher. Remember, we have the 16th Amendment. And eventually the highest tax rates would go up to over 60%. I'll tell you how taxes work. Down the road, nobody paid 60% of their income in taxes at that time. That's not the way taxes work. But I'll do that next week or the beginning of the week after. Next, bonds. They had to borrow a significant amount of money. So here is an advertisement to get American citizens to buy bonds. They first started doing this in the Civil War, but they got average people to loan them money. They called them Liberty bonds. In World War II, they called them war bonds. And here it says, why did they convince people we need to loan the U.S. government money? What a weird way they do things. To pay for the war after a Zeppelin raid in London. Remember that? Prevent this in New York, implying the Germans are coming for us. That's totally unrealistic, but scaring people. But it wasn't quite enough. And they didn't know what to do with the fact that there's going to be massive demand for everything. And prices are going to skyrocket. Prices are going to double. So that means an inflation rate of 100% in 1918. Now, right now, mostly because of oil prices and home prices, and also gouging by companies, we have inflation of 7.9% now, which is by far higher than anything you've seen in your life. And this goes back 40 years. And it's high. It's not. It could go down very fast because oil, it's very volatile, oil and food prices. And companies are gouging because they know prices are going up. 100% though, can you imagine that? So even if your wages went up 50%, how will you feed your family? How will you pay your rent? Most people didn't own their own homes. What are you going to do? Yeah.
Is mobilization something that's like nationally declared?
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't actually say we're mobilizing, but yeah, essentially we're declaring. Essentially, the government's going to take over the finances, take over the economy, and it just kind of generically called mobilization. Yeah, this is literally the state takes over everything. And also, companies that were once producing cars, like the brand new Model T, Ford, now are supposed to be producing carriages for artillery. That means what happens to the prices of cars because no one's producing them now? Skyrocket. Or food that's now going to the front, that means food prices are going to go up. Demand goes up. War always does this. In World War II, they did a much better job of controlling inflation. Much better. So Wilson came up with the idea, let's create war boards to organize the entire economy, going away from his anti-monopoly ideas. And basically what he was going to do is bribe these companies. We're going to give you huge contracts if you start producing weapons for war or turning over your railroads, everything else, recondition it for war transport. They gave this the name war socialism during the war, but it wasn't really war socialism. War socialism implying that the government took over. In World War II, the government took over, and it worked much better. Because here, companies didn't want to change. They're making a lot of money, and they didn't want to quit. And so when the U.S. government started saying, hey, we'll give you more money, what did they say? Oh, you're going to give us more money? Not enough. Give me more. Give me more. Give me more. All of this would be organized on what they called the War Industries Board. Bernard Baruch, who was a financier, was in charge. And the thought was, we'll organize everything. Did it work? I already hinted no. Large numbers of American rifles, trucks, artillery, planes would not start being produced until January and February of 1919. What's the problem with January and February of 1919? The war had been over for 3 months. U.S. troops, when they went to war, most of them had British Enfield rifles. The tanks were French. The planes were Spads, French planes. Most of the artillery, French. By the way, the French charged top dollar for that. And so it was a disaster. The only one that had any success, the Food Administration under Herbert Hoover. And the Hoover, I always mispronounce that name, and I can't help it. And trust me, we'll have a lot of Hoover talk in about a week, 2 weeks. Herbert Hoover was a self-made man, so he really was. He was orphaned, became an engineer. Through some smart moves, he became a millionaire, which was a heck of a lot of money back then. I'm not saying it's not a lot now, but a heck of a lot then. And he organized food production in such a way that not only did the United States have a surplus, but they were able to send millions of tons of food to starving Europe and then to starving Russians during the Civil War. He's going to come out of the war with maybe the greatest reputation of any American. His reputation now is not quite as good, and we'll get to why. His presidency. So there's Hoover right there, and the Food Administration and telling rich people you're going to have to cut back, convincing people to grow victory gardens. And so with that, what about the Army? The last thing for today. The bell is going to ring. So I've got to get to the 20s video, but I guess we'll have to wait till Monday. I'm going to decide. Come to class tomorrow. We might jump ahead. So maybe I want everyone here for that last bit of the war. One more thing. Who's going to be gone tomorrow? If you're going to be gone, come over here and get the... If we watch the movie, I will have a copy of it online. The worksheet's in your bag. It's a fantastic movie. Right? What are you going to watch? Yeah. It actually is really good.
Okay.
It's the same guy. It's done at a different time, but they interviewed people from the 1920s. It's really good. Anyone else going to be gone?
Thank you.
That? It was really cool. Anyone else? Anyone else?
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. What's your shirt? What's Halsey?
She's a...
Oh, I've heard of that. Okay. I had in my head. Okay. I had in my head an admiral. And I'm pretty sure the admiral wouldn't have roses, so I was confused. See you Monday. The Cold War map. That's the map when I was your age.
Also, I didn't realize that Finland was part of Russia.
Yeah, Finland was part of Russia all the way up until they won their independence. Because they declared independence in, I think, January 19.
Is there like a big fight over that, or was Russia just like, okay, yeah?
At that time, they had no choice. But in 1939, it's called the Winter War. The Soviet Union's going to attack and try to push its workers right here. So pushing back against it. And it was a one awful. Finns actually did really well, but they're overwhelmed.
No.
Which kind of.
Wait, go on though? I know that happens to other girls.
But
And then
then after World War II, so Finland actually joined the Nazi.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. That's
Enemy of my enemy.
the middle. Oh, that's what I meant. Oh, like, yeah, that's actually boring. Like that. That's really about how.